have a question for you. Is there such a thing as blind faith? How many of you would say, yes, there is? Okay. I want us to read a verse together. Let's go ahead and put it up there. 2 Corinthians 5:7. We live by faith, not by sight. Would you go ahead and read that again? We live by faith, not by sight. Now, we've all gone through some pretty dark times in our lives. Would you agree? We've gone through difficult times. Maybe there's been a loss of a loved one, or financial difficulties, or just a dark time where you just couldn't figure out a way out. You just can't see a way through it. How many of you have ever said, I just can't see how this is going to work out? I just can't see how somebody would treat another person like that. I just can't see or make sense of this. How many of you have ever used those words, I just can't see? Okay, maybe you've even used those today. And, I want to talk with you this morning a little bit. A couple weeks ago, I told you I was going to share a story of our personal life of where we had lost everything and how God restored everything back. And I want to talk with you about how we were in one of the darkest seasons of our lives. The darkest times. It was during the Great Recession. And for my wife and I, we just couldn't see. It was like a dark time. It was a blind time. We just can't see how this is going to work out. How many of you remember the Great Recession? Well, I'm going to talk to you a little bit. And if you've been around here, you've heard part of this story. But there's a portion of this story I've never told before. And it was for some specific reasons, which I'll share as we get a little bit closer to that. But in 1996, my wife and I, we had this crazy idea that we were going to build a house. As an owner-builder, you could buy a piece of land and you can build a house. Did you know that? Now, you got to apply for permits and everything. Everything has to be inspected. It's not like you can just go build some, terrible thing. But we'd never built a house before, but somehow we had this idea, hey, we're gonna build a house. And so we began the process, and, we didn't hire, very few people were hired. Maybe the guy that did the cement, the mechanical guy, but for the most part, me, friends, we'd get together, frame the house, roof the house, drywall the house. In fact, that's how I met Bob Kinslow. Bob, can you raise your hand right there? Bob Kinslow came over and helped wire the house. He wanted to make sure, his son was in my youth group, and he had heard that we were going to wire our own house. He thought, I need to go help them. They're going to burn the house down. And so, long story short on that, because we didn't hire a general contractor and we didn't hire a lot of the specialty contractors, when this house was done, we had a tremendous amount of equity in the home. A tremendous amount of value was there. And as we'd lived in the home for several years, the value of that home had gone up. How many of you, the value of your home from when you moved in till now, the value has gone up, right? That amount is called the equity in the home. And I'd met with a friend, and he shared this idea with me. And at first, I thought, I don't know about that. But on paper, it looked like a really good idea. His idea was, why don't you draw the equity out, and you could invest it, maybe buy other properties. And I went, gosh, I don't really know how to do that kind of stuff, but on paper it seemed like a good idea. And so we drew, and I'm going to give you a big number here, we drew $178,000 of equity out of this home. Okay? Because there's a lot of equity there, and it had grown. Now let me tell you what happens when you draw the equity out is you move from having one loan to having two loans. But we thought, that's no problem. We're going to be real estate tycoons. So we went out and bought our first rental property, and of course, that cost something to buy one, and then we had to pay money to fix the thing, and then you move a renter in there, and they're helping cover things. And that went so good, we thought, let's do another one. So we did. We bought another one, same thing. We fixed it up. We get a renter in there. And you know what? It's going good. And by this time, we had all that money tied up, but no problem at all, because the banks say, well, you guys are doing such a good job. We'll just give you all the money you need to buy a third one. So here we were now. We were with 3 houses, plus the original house, so a total of 4 houses. And all of this just before the entire economy tanked. So the economy tanks. The money at the church dropped out, just like the floor dropped right out. It was a tough decision for the council, but they had to make the decision to lay me off. Couldn't pay me. And they didn't lay me off from the work, just the pay. And, so what did I have to do? I went out and relaunched my flooring installation business. How many of you know when you're in the middle of a recession, that's a really hard time to start a construction trade business, right? Not to mention a lot of the renters, the renters were losing their jobs, and so they stopped paying rent. Needless to say, it was a dark time. It was like a landslide. A landslide just buried on top of us. And we couldn't see a thing. We couldn't make sense of it. We couldn't figure out what's going to happen here. And we knew that God loved us, but we had no idea what his plan was through all of this. And little by little, what would happen is the bank would come and snatch that property away, and then they took that property away. Then they snatched that property away. And now we're left with the original home, which in the past had all this equity. Now we're paying 2 full mortgages on this house that is deeply underwater. The value of the home is here, and the loans now on the home are way up there. And because of where we were at in our personal lives, it became very clear early on there was no way we can pay both of these loans. Couldn't see a way out. We knew God loved us. We didn't know what his plan was, but we felt awfully blind. We said, Jesus, you're going to have to handle this. We need your touch. How many of you know when you're in a dark time, when you just can't see how this is going to work out, you need a touch from God, right? So here we are now. We're living in this home we can't afford. And I want to get back to this story here in just a moment, because we're going to take a look at a story of a blind beggar in the Bible by the name of blind Bartimaeus. Who's heard of blind Bartimaeus? Obviously, he was a blind man, and we learn from his stories on how to navigate through those dark times when you can't see a thing. Go ahead and grab your outline this morning. What do you do when you cannot see a thing? It's in Mark chapter 10, and the story is also paralleled in Luke 18. But in Luke 18, there's something that's said that I want to make sure I point out as well. Let me read this to you. Then they came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. Now, when he had heard that it was Jesus, now let me read what it says in Luke 18. When he heard the crowd going by, he asked, "What's happening?" They told him, "Jesus of Nazareth is passing by." Would you say that with me? Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. So he began to shout, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many rebuked him and told him, "You be quiet." But he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Verse 49, would you read it with me? Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." I love it. Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." So they called the blind man, "Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you." Go ahead and read along with me in verse 50. Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet, he came to Jesus. Verse 51, "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked him. The blind man said, "Rabbi, I want to see." Verse 52, Jesus said, "Go." Jesus said, "Your faith has healed you." Immediately what? He received his sight and he followed Jesus along the road. So one of the very first things we learn from Bartimaeus is when you are in a very dark time, that's a really good time to call out to Jesus. Amen. A dark time is a really good time to call out to Jesus. Now let me tell you, he's along the road outside of Jericho. It's a trade route, so that would have been a very good place to position yourself if you were going to beg. So he positions himself, but that particular day he perceives something's different. He's blind. He doesn't know exactly what's going on, but there's more commotion that day going on. So he asks somebody, he says, what's going on? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. Would you say that with me? Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. Those words right there echo such hope for us. Now, let me pick up in verse 47. It says, when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, this is interesting. I want you to notice. They tell him it's Jesus of Nazareth, and it says when he had heard it was Jesus of Nazareth, he doesn't shout, Jesus of Nazareth. Look what he shouts. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. See, Jesus of Nazareth was his generic title. It would be like saying, Steve, the guy from Troutdale. Or, Doug and Carol from Corbett. Jesus, the guy from Nazareth. But this guy stops and says, no, this isn't just the guy from Nazareth. This is different. This is Jesus, the Son of David. And with those words, essentially what he was echoing is, I recognize this is the Messiah that was promised. This is the King of Kings that has come to establish his kingdom on earth. This is the Christ. And this may be news for you, but did you know Christ is not Jesus' last name? The word Christ means the anointed one of God. And so when he says these words, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me, he's recognizing this is the Christ. Who's there? Well, it's Jesus of Nazareth. No, this isn't just Jesus of Nazareth. This is Jesus, the Messiah. It's interesting to me that a guy that was physically blind was one of the first people to perceive and recognize Jesus for who he truly was and is, right? The religious people were blind, and yet a blind man could somehow see. Think about that for a moment. So people around Bartimaeus, they tell him, be quiet. They tell him, you just be quiet. And let me tell you something. There will be people, there will be the devil, there will be your past, there will be a lot of voices, a lot of chatter that will try to silence you as you're crying out to Jesus and you can't see a way. And the devil's trying to tell you, there's no way, why don't you just shut up? But I love the fact that this man shouted even louder. Can I just tell you, when you can't see a thing, that's a really good time to call out to Jesus. When all the voices are telling you that ain't going to work, you just shout out all the louder. Amen? Can we give the Lord applause for that? Here's the second thing I want to talk with you about, is that in the darkness, in those times where you cannot see how this is going to work out, keep making faith decisions no matter the chatter. No matter the chatter, okay? Keep making faith decisions. Just keep doing what Jesus said to do in the Bible. You may not know how this is going to work out. You can't see a way, but you just keep doing what Jesus said to do. Now, let me pick it up here in Mark 10, let me read it. It says, many rebuked him and told him, be quiet. But he shouted all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus stopped. Would you say that with me? Jesus stopped. So Jesus stops. He recognizes, hey, this is different. Almost like the story last week with the woman who touched Jesus, and he recognized, no, this one's different. She's not just brushing up against me. Her faith reached through and touched me. And here, there's a lot of people in that crowd, and Jesus recognizes there's something different. This man recognizes, I am the Messiah, that I am the Christ. And that stopped Jesus in his tracks. As he's crying out, as people were telling him, you be quiet. That happens in life. Where people, essentially what were they saying when they were telling the blind man, you be quiet? What were they telling him? You're not worthy. Hey, Jesus isn't interested in people like you. You've got problems, okay? We'll all beg to differ. But that's essentially what they were telling the man when he's calling out and they say, you be quiet. Jesus isn't interested in your type. He's not interested in your kind. And he's like, no, I know something about this Jesus. And so he called all the louder. I love that. I love that. Now let me continue with this story. Let's see, where did I leave off at? A pretty desperate place. We're living in the original house. Now instead of having equity in the home that we started with, we now have 2 full loans for a home that's deeply underwater. Its value is here. These 2 loan payments are there. We're in transition with our lives, starting a new business, and of course feeding our families, serving our church. That was a bigger priority to us than continuing to live in that house. So we made a really difficult decision. It was a decision we felt like we needed to make. And I'm not advocating everybody go do this. I'm just telling you our story. Okay? We stopped paying the loan. We stopped paying the bank. Now, if you ever want to have a negotiating meeting with the bank, that's when it happens right there. So they call us, an advisor calls. They want to set up a meeting, kind of a financial counselor, where let's take a look at all, your finances. What do you have coming in? And what are all the bills that you have? And let's see if there's a way that we could make this work. And after we'd gone through that meeting, and here's where I'm picking up the story that you've not heard before. The counselor made a recommendation to us. They said, well, if you'll stop giving your monthly support to the church, then you'll be able to pay this other loan. Okay? If you'll stop tithing, you'll be able to cover this. And I remember telling the man, I said, sir, with all due respect, I will not rob from God to pay a man. And we had already resolved, okay, in making that decision, what we were essentially saying was, it was a higher priority for us to stay faithful in obeying God and returning the tithe, even if it resulted in us being evicted from that house. Now, I'm not telling all of you to do that. I'm saying for us, this is where we were at. He said to do this, and we're going to keep doing this, even if it might result in that. Are you guys with me? And it was similar to, some similarities to the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they wanted them to bow down and recognize this guy over here as God, some guy full of himself. That's God. We all need to bow down and worship him. And they said, we're not doing it. And they said, well, if you don't, you're going to get thrown into the fiery furnace. And you remember what they said was, well, our God is able to deliver us. But even if he chooses not to, we're not going to bow to this guy. What were they saying? It may result in our life, but it doesn't change our conviction. We're going to obey God. No matter how dark the situation is, no matter how difficult the situation is, we are going to continue to obey God in the darkness and make faith decisions. More time goes by, we're preparing to vacate the home. And I want to tell you the most amazing surprise we did not see coming. Because remember, it was dark, we couldn't see a way, right? We don't see how this is going to work out. We're getting ready to vacate the home for the bank to take over our very last property, the property we start, that was our home. And we thought, you know what? When we were first married, we didn't have anything. It'll just kind of be like going back to square one. We go out to the mailbox, and here's a letter from the bank with the second note, which they've sent us a lot of letters. But this one was different. This one was different. I read it, and I went, Kelly read this, does this sound like what it seems like it sounds? That second note, $178,000, they said, we're forgiving that debt. They wiped it out. You never saw that happen. And I'm going to tell you, in one fell second, all that was there, all was lost in moments of stupidity. I'm going to tell you something. You may do stupid stuff, and God's still in your corner. Now, I'm not advocating go do stupid stuff. All I'm saying is we do stupid stuff, and God's sometimes going, I'm still here for you. And all was lost. We couldn't see a way. And we said, in the middle, we're going to stay faithful. We're going to stay obedient. And what happened was God fought our battles. God fought for us. And all that was lost was now restored. That's an amazing story, isn't it? I think we need to give the Lord an applause for that. Now, the reason I tell you that story is this. When you're in the midst of a dark time and you can't see a way, call out to Jesus and stay obedient to what he said to do. You may not see a way, but still stay steady, stay faithful to what God has called you to do. Faith is demonstrated when you have choices in front of you and you keep choosing God's way, even though the chatter may be saying, you need to do it this way. Are you with me? Even though the voices are saying, stop doing it God's way, do it that way. That's essentially what the bank was telling us. You understand that, right? That's what the bank was telling us. Now, how does this play out in real life? Faith is most demonstrated when you have choices. I could do it this way, I could do it this way, or I could do it this way. And this way's God's way, but this one doesn't make the most sense, but that's God's way, so I'm going to do it his way. And when you do it his way, you've now given him permission to fight your battles for you. You can't see a way, but he's behind the scenes making a way. Someone may offer you a better paying job, but you're going to have to miss church to do it, right? Hey, I can't go to church anymore because I got a better paying job. What does the Bible say about this? It said, don't forsake that. I can tell you this when you say thank you for that offer, but I'm going to choose to keep going to church and trust God for a better job. Can I tell you, he will give you a better job. Amen? When you make faith decisions to say, I'm going to keep doing it God's way. Maybe you're a young lady and you think, man, I would sure love to have a husband. And what appears to be your knight in shining armor shows up. And he tells you how much he loves you. He says, but there's one thing. I don't believe in this Jesus guy. But I want to marry you. You going to make a faith decision? What's your decision of faith at that point? Because first off, what did the Bible say about that? What does he say? Do not be yoked or do not be joined together with a non-believer. It's not saying don't have friends that don't know Jesus, but if you're getting married, for Pete's sake, marry somebody going the same direction. Are you guys with me? And so here you are. You've got choices. Hey, this guy wants to marry me, but God says this. My faith is demonstrated by will I do it, by what God said. And trust that he's going to bring the right person. Are you guys with me? And so when you're in the midst of those difficult times where there's choices that are there, just like there was a choice for us. Choice. Yes, choice in front of us. Choose God's way. Amen? Here's the last thing I want to say about this. Throw off your labels and come to Jesus. Turn to the person next to you and say, throw off the labels and come to Jesus. This is interesting. If you do a little study on this passage, it says Jesus called the man, and look what it says in 10:50. Throwing his cloak aside. Would you say that with me? Throwing his cloak aside. He jumped to his feet, and he came to Jesus. Now, this is significant because in those days, if you had a legitimate disability, you would be granted by the government an official beggar's cloak. Okay? They gave you permission to essentially go stand by the side of the road. It's how you made your living. The government recognized this is a person with a disability. Let's give them that beggar's coat. And it signals to everybody it's okay for him to do this, and we want to look out for this guy. And it's interesting that when he calls to Jesus, and Jesus says, come, the very first thing that he does is what? He threw it off. He threw that off, and he comes to Jesus. See, everywhere where you went, people would know that guy's disadvantaged. That coat is what gave you permission to beg. Everywhere you went, people would feel sorry for you. It kind of gave you the right to have self-pity and feel bad for yourself. But when Jesus said, come, the very first thing this guy did, he threw off the label. He flipped the switch. He said, no, I'm not going to live by this label anymore. I have been a victim, but that was in the old days. I'm now a victor. And he threw off the label, and he ran to Jesus. I think that's a significant story right there. God is on the throne. We got to get rid of the excuses and just get a hold of Jesus. Now, I'm not saying that the things that you've gone through were not difficult, that they were not terrible things. I'm not being unsympathetic. Do you understand? But what I'm saying is whatever you've gone through is no longer a reason for you to stay stuck as a victim. It's time to throw it off and come to Jesus. Because as long as you self-loathe, you're just going to stay stuck. You're going to stay stuck. Jesus is calling you. You got to peel off those labels. Amen? Don't let the excuses keep you from coming to him. So Bartimaeus took off the coat. He leaves his livelihood. He leaves his label behind. I got a question for you. What do you need to leave behind today? What do you need to leave behind? What are some of the labels you carry around? Widow? Addict? What are some of the other labels? Smoker? Bitter? Lost? Angry? Resentment? Here, this is what I'm telling you. I'm not saying those things are not real. What I'm saying is at some point when you keep looking at the label, I'm just a blind beggar. You're just going to stay stuck. And at some point you have to hear, Jesus is calling you. And say, I'm going to throw this off. I'm coming to him. Amen? We need to give Jesus an applause for that. And then Jesus asks the question, what do you want me to do for you? That's interesting because most people will say, he's blind. Jesus recognized that man may be dealing with things beyond simply being blind. And he wanted to give him an opportunity to unpack it all. Interesting. Now, he simply said, I want to see. And that's a pretty big deal right there. But I got news for you. Jesus of Nazareth, or shall I submit to you, Jesus Christ is passing by. When you're in the dark, you call to him. The naysayers may tell you, look, he's not interested in people like you. But all I got to tell you is look to the cross. That is proof he is deeply interested in people like you. Throw off the labels. Throw off the victim mentality, and let's get to Jesus. So he asked Bartimaeus, what do you want me to do for you? I want to see. Jesus said, your faith has healed you. God is saying, your faith is going to turn things around. It's interesting that when Jesus called him to come, he was still blind, wasn't he? Think about this. When Jesus said, come, he was still blind at that moment. And yet, in his blindness, he chose to respond to what he heard Jesus say. That's what you do when you're in a dark time. You respond to what Jesus has said. How many of you are in a time where I need healing from God? I need a healing from him. Raise your hand if that's you. Okay? In your time where you need healing, that's a good time for you to hear what he said. By my stripes, you're healed. How many of you got the bills piled up and you just can't see how this is going to work? Raise them up. When you're in that dark time, hear what he's already said. I am the God that meets your needs. I'm the one that owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Anybody having difficulty with your kids? Who's having a tough time with your kids? What has he already said? As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. You begin to declare that over your family, over your household. Now, the reason why I resisted sharing that story with you about ceasing to pay our loan and the whole rest of it is I don't want you to sit there and saying, hey, Pastor Dave's telling us to quit paying our mortgage. No, I'm not telling you that. What I'm saying was we were at a place where where feed our family or feed the bank. Okay? Pay our tithe or pay the bank. And we had already resolved we're willing to lose our house. So you need to understand if you're going to stop paying your loan, you have to resolve you may lose your house. Do you understand that? You may lose it. We'd already determined we may lose this, but we're going to obey God on this thing. We didn't know at that time that he was behind the scenes making a way. But let's say hypothetically we had lost the home. The bank didn't forgive that, and we lost it. Would we still love Jesus? Will we keep serving him? You better believe it. We had just recognized, God, we're not sure, but we know you have another plan, and we're going to keep obeying you and keep walking because you got something better coming for us. Amen? And so that's how you stay in faith, and it's important for us to do that. Blind Bartimaeus, man, he is such a good guy for us to learn from because this is a guy that truly was in the dark. And in the dark, that's a good time. Call out for Jesus. And when people tell you he's not interested in your kind, call all the more. Stay in faith. Stay obedient. Do what Jesus said to do. Even though you may not see a way, he's making a way.